You're listening to Investigation Insiders by Integris Intelligence.
Welcome again, everyone. Episode number 4. Thank you all for tuning in and all your feedback. It's been super helpful. So, looking forward to today's episode. Joining me again today are Jo Mauro and John Burke. How are you doing today, Joe?
I am doing great. Hello, everybody.
Hey, John. How are you?
Hey, Farhad. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, no, it's looking forward to today. It should be, again, another interesting discussion. As we all know, there's an election around the corner, and there's all kinds of discussion about it. And so, as we discussed earlier, we thought it would be a good idea to address an issue that's come up with our clients over the past few weeks, which is potential for post-election civil unrest in the U.S. So, needless to say, every organization should be concerned about safeguarding its employees and assets in the event of civil unrest that potentially gets out of hand. Obviously, aside from the duty of care requirements, there are reputational and or liability issues that you need to be thinking about. So what we're going to do is a high-level review of what you should be thinking about in preparation for potential unrest. So we're going to touch on a few key areas. So the preparedness and response team, performing a risk assessment, even a basic one, obtaining and monitoring intelligence, your overall operations and business continuity, and communication in general. So, obviously, what we're talking about today is going to be pretty specific, but many of the principles can really be applied to other situations as well. So, I'm going to turn it over to Joe to take it from here.
Thank you, Farhad. So I want to get started by talking about the preparedness and response team. John, can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. And again, guys, thanks for having me back. This is certainly a cool little adventure you guys have embarked on. In terms of emergency crisis and preparedness, every organization should have a team that is really dedicated to that. The team should be multidisciplined. It should have multiple levels in that it should include, executive management, human resources, risk management, legal, security, all the elements of a fully functioning business. And we certainly understand that there's organizations that don't have all those positions. But you should be thinking of them any time that you have or are planning for an event or in a crisis that may come up. You should also be thinking about chain of command and who those, you should have assigned roles, and responsibilities. You should be thinking about who is the lead for this project, who are the administrators, who's in charge of communications, be they internal, external. Another important factor is really having somebody that's a law enforcement liaison, somebody who interfaces with your local police department and who has the information that they can provide to you of any concerning events that might be coming up. And something that's really important is that these teams should really meet regularly and document all their efforts. And when I say regularly, it doesn't mean what we're talking about today, and just because something we expect that is coming up, but it should be throughout the year. And that really will hone your skills and prepare you in the unlikely event, hopefully, that a crisis comes up. And when we say document, Farhad was talking about that a little bit earlier. Documenting all these efforts can protect you from possible liability down the road.
Awesome.
Yeah, just to follow up, I really like that point you just made. The last point that you just made, and I want to add one thing to what you said, is the idea of don't just wait for a crisis to occur or wait for the possibility of one occurring, like what we're talking about on this podcast, but sort of have a regular process where you're going through these discussions regularly to kind of hone your skills. So that's a really, really important point, because it really is a lifestyle. It's almost like, your personal habits, your business habits, and your organizational habits are going to make a big difference in terms of how prepared you are. So really good point on that. The one other thing I just want to add is external resources, right? So again, you made the point about, you may not have all of these positions or people internally. You may be a two-person organization. Who knows, what your company looks like. So you should also have external resources, whether they be security companies, consultants, or whatever kind of potential crisis that you're preparing for. Make sure you have those resources that are outside of your organization that can supplement as needed, so that you can appropriately respond.
Great. Thank you, guys. Thank you, John, for all of that. Since you've jumped in there, let's move on and discuss a risk assessment. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, performing a risk assessment, even a pretty basic one, is fundamental to preparing and responding to a crisis or emergency. I mean, if you don't perform a risk assessment, you don't know where your gaps are, and you don't know what changes you need to make. And that certainly applies to potential civil unrest, right? So the complexity and the scope of an assessment is going to vary from organization to organization, right? So, for example, if you have a single location in the middle of a rural area, your assessment is likely going to differ from a retail organization that's in the center of, urban areas that have had previous civil unrest. So again, the scope is going to vary, but you should do something that's appropriate to your organization regardless. Ultimately, the goal of the assessment is to identify gaps and solutions to fill those gaps. So in this scenario, we're a week away from the election, less than a week away. And so it's pretty late in the game. So, but there's still a lot of things that you can do, right? So in assessing what your potential risks are, you have to think about a few things. So let's start with the type of organization you are. As I mentioned, are you a manufacturer that has a facility in the middle of, a lot of green area, or are you in the middle of a city? Has there been any controversy? Do you have people in your organization and or your organization associated with anything that's going on in the current climate that might create additional risks for your organization? So you have to think about that. Location or locations, obviously that's a very, very important part of this particular assessment. Are there areas of concern? Has there been activity already this past year or in recent history that would put your organization or part of your organization at a higher risk category? Obviously, previous history of unrest as it relates to those areas. Can you monitor and or obtain intelligence? Do you have the capability internally to do that, or do you have the combination of internal and external resources to be able to monitor those things? And then your employee population. Obviously, the pandemic in a strange way has reduced risk for many organizations, because oftentimes the risk for civil unrest is when you're transiting, right, from home to work or work to home or in between or whatever the case may be. Many people are still working from home, so that reduces the risk in general. But that's an assessment you have to make: is what does your employee population look like? Are they mostly working from home? Are they going in? And what are the risks if they are going in? And then the property itself. Are you on the ground floor with, like a retail location, or are you a tenant within a managed building? Do you have a CCTV system? Is it functioning? Things like that. Those are all things, pretty basic steps that you can sort of take a look at. Also, communication. Do you have the ability to disseminate information to your employees and other relevant people with your organization? A mass notification system or something of that sort? Is all of your employee contact information accurate so that you can communicate with them? And then again, going back to the resources, do you have the resources to respond, whether it's internal or external, to protect or respond in case there are threats against your people or assets? So just again, reviewing a few of the basic things. There's obviously much more. It's going to differ by what type of organization you are. But, once you sort of do that assessment, then you'll be able to determine what you need to do to take the necessary steps and fill the gaps that your or the risks, address the risks that your organization faces as a result of, potential unrest, or if it actually happens.
Wow. So that's a lot of information there. So let me ask you this. What if an organization just doesn't have the resources and time to do all of this? It seems pretty complex and time consuming to me.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely is, Joe. This is very complex and it's late in the game. But regardless, there are things that you can do, even if you don't have the resources or even if you haven't started. So, I think the first step is obtaining and monitoring intelligence to determine potential risk, right? So obviously, you can monitor the news and media. And that's going to be very, very important. But you'll also need to communicate with like your local police department. Joe, maybe you can talk about that a little bit. How can an organization get information from their local police department or intelligence in general?
Sure. Well, there's a few things that they can do. First, you can monitor the department's website and social media feeds. Secondly, you can reach out directly to the department and they'll provide information on how to get intelligence from them. This could be as simple as joining an email list or having you participate in calls or community meetings. Another great way of gaining intelligence is to speak to those people and businesses around you. This could be a great source of info. Many times, as we've all seen, when in crisis situations, the best comes out in people and they are very willing to stand up and lend a helping hand.
That's a great point, Joe. I think you were spot on with that. John, do you have anything to add to that part of it? Again, I think the question led from Joe saying, the assessment is great. There's obviously I spoke about a lot of information, but what if, obviously it's late in the game, and what if we just don't have the resources? Anything else you have to add to that, particularly in terms of gaining intelligence?
Yeah, in my experience, having worked with multiple law enforcement agencies around the country, is that usually they have some sort of, community resource officer or whatever that they may call it in their, local jurisdiction, that will be your liaison that will provide you with necessary information to business folks.
Thanks. So, John, once you get the intelligence you need and determine your risk, what's next?
Yeah, well, Farhad certainly explained a lot there, and I think one of the key points is how working from home has not only shifted, our society, but really the risk to employees, be it in transit or at the workplace. So during these times, and if you obtain intelligence that says that there may be possible unrest in your area, we would certainly suggest that your employees continue to work from home as best as they can. Also, business continuity plans should be initiated, especially if there's any potential threats that are reported. If you have folks that are required to come in, you should have your evacuation and lockdown plans in place, and make sure those are reviewed and up to date. Make sure you're communicating with your building property management. A lot of folks are in multi-tenant buildings, so it's important that you actually know what the building itself is doing to prepare for anything. You should also make sure that your facility is up to date with all the local fire codes. One thing that we've seen during the unrest over the past couple of months is obviously a lot of fire setting. So you want to make sure that you have your fire suppression systems are all in working order. You want to make sure all your cameras and electronic systems are working. Hopefully nothing happens, but you want to make sure that if it does, that you have those events captured on CCTV. And you also, one thing I don't know if we've talked about, I think Forhad, you might have touched upon it, is making sure that you have the extra security personnel in place in case you need it. If you do need it the day of the event and you haven't planned for it, it might be too late. Resources are drying up pretty quickly, I think. So you want to start thinking about it now. I think we're only 8 or 9 days out, and you really have to get those assets in place now, or it might be too late.
John, on that point, actually, I just want to elaborate on that as well. That last point, I think that's super important. So sometimes, again, to get the assets in place, organizations, what they're doing is either adding the personnel in advance so that the new personnel can get familiarized with the building, property, whatever it might be. Or just to have them ready to go in case you need it. John makes a critical point here. For those people that call after they need it, you're not going to get the help or the kind of help you're looking for right in the time that you need it. Or B, you're going to probably end up spending a lot more money to get it. So preparing for it, knowing that it's not that far away, is going to help you greatly, both from a response standpoint, a financial standpoint, and just overall transition standpoint.
Thanks, guys. I would like to hear a little bit more about the importance of proper communication during a crisis. John?
Yeah, commos are certainly one of the most important things during any critical or dangerous situation. I can tell you from experience that the first thing to go is communications. So you should always be planning. One thing I notice whenever I'm watching TV is if you listen to the difference in a voice on a 911 call versus trained police officer speaking, you can tell that they're pretty much used to stressful events and they're able to provide information in a clear and concise manner, whereas 911 calls are, hurried, rushed, panicked, whatever it might be. So I'm always saying planning. And there's so many reasons why this is important. First, it shows that you were prepared, and care about your employees and other customers and whatever relevant parties it might be. Second, you really want to make sure the information is accurate. In this day and age of social media, so much false information is spread so quickly that you as an organization want to make sure that you have a timely manner to really make sure the information is correct. And you really want to make sure communication between your management employees is really a two-way streak. You want to make sure that they can communicate to you and that you're also providing the proper information.
Very true. Thank you. Forhad, so let's move forward, and I'm going to ask you to jump into the next segment. So what are our takeaways for this podcast?
So again, it's pretty last minute at this point, and we talked about a lot in a short amount of time. So if I had to highlight one thing or a couple of things that we've discussed, is that it's not too late, right? So if you haven't prepared or you haven't prepared enough, there are still definitely things that can be done even now. Not doing anything would be a big mistake. Obviously, feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. I guess I throw that question back to you guys as well. Are there any takeaways that you guys would want to highlight for an organization this late in the game preparing for potential civil unrest? Joe or John, I throw it back to you.
Yeah, I think I'm a broken record, but back to my Secret Service days, it's planning, planning, planning. And we talked about it a little before earlier in the segment that you should have these emergency crisis teams in place already throughout the year. Whereas, as we're talking about the upcoming election, it wouldn't even be a big deal because you already had the team in place, the plan in place, and it would just be another event for you to manage.
Yeah, I agree. And there's no reason to not be super prepared beforehand. There's no such thing as being too prepared. You never know what's going to happen. So definitely a recommendation on that front.
Awesome. Well, that concludes this particular episode. Thank you all again for joining us. Please subscribe and/or continue sending your comments. We want to hear from you. You can find out how to reach out to us in the description section of the podcast. Thank you very much. Thanks, Joe and John.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Don't forget to follow Integris Intelligence on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter.